Today, we're talking about setting up a remote development environment. So what are we talking about when we say remote development environment? So we're specifically talking about putting your code and your application, a version of the application, including potentially databases, etc., on a remote machine somewhere. So this remote machine could be a VM in the cloud. It could be a machine in your home, sitting right next to your main development machine. Or any other combinations like a Proxmox server or things like that. So why set up a remote development environment? So for me, primary reasons are to offload processing power. Like if my development environment is running a server that requires a lot of memory, a lot of running Docker containers, perhaps my IDE is requiring a lot of memory, and I don't want to bog down my current machine because I'm working on multiple projects at the same time, it would be good to move one of those projects to a remote development environment. Another reason is touted is consistency, right? If you have a consistent flow to set up a remote development environment, then anyone working on that project should be able to replicate that and have a consistent environment. Another reason is, like I mentioned before, is to have multiple environments. I can have an environment in my local machine. I can have a remote environment for either another project or another version of the same project. And then I can even have several of those. You can access it from anywhere, remote, obviously. Another benefit is collaboration. So for example, I did some development work on my remote environment. I have the database set up and what's needed for this specific feature. And then I hand it off to either another engineer or to QA to continue working on that feature. Another potential benefit is security, right? It's remote. So if you forget your laptop somewhere, your data is not lost. It's scalable. You can spin it up. Potentially cost effective, although in my opinion, that's maybe questionable. All right, so let's move on to actually setting up a development environment. So in this demo, I'm going to be using DigitalOcean, but you can use any other providers. And I've already set a development environment up. So I will just go through some steps setting up a new one. So basically I would go create a droplet and then Ubuntu, that's fine. And then pick the size. In my case, what I really want is 16 gigs, but DigitalOcean hasn't allowed me to use 16 gig droplets yet. So let's do a regular, and you can see the prices here. Like if I'm actually wanting to run 16 gigs, that's going to cost me approximately $1,200 a year. So that's questionable how cost effective it is unless I'm willing to spin it down like over the weekend or whenever I'm not using it. All right, so create a droplet and the droplet's creating. So then after the droplet is created, I'm basically going to go through the steps for my application. Like in this case, I'm building this application fleet. And I'm going to go through the steps to actually set it all up. Now, this could all be automated with the script, but in this case, it's kind of a manual process. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to pause the video okay, it looks like it's up. Let me at least set SSH into it. So we've got the IP address. Let's do another window here. Increase the font. All right, SSH root at IP. Yes. Let's see, is this gonna work? Touch ID. All right, all good, I'm in. So now I'm just gonna run through some of these steps to set up my app. I'm gonna pause the video because these are kind of app-specific steps. Okay, so while that's going, let's talk about another important thing is that in my application that I'm installing, I need to run multiple processes. I need to run Docker, I need to run a builder for the front end that refreshes with new code. So I need to have I need to run the server itself. So I need to have multiple processes running, and I want to be able to visually monitor them, right? So a popular tool for that is tmux, so that you set up all these processes, all these windows, how you want them, and then you can reconnect to the server and see them all. One nice thing I found is that iTerm2 offers tmux integration. So basically, when you bring up tmux on the remote server from your Mac, it looks just like an iTerm. So let's show how this works. So I still got the install working on the new server. So let me look. Let me use. History is messing up. Okay. Let me SSH to the other one. SSH root at. Let's go to the other one. Okay. And here, I already have started a tmux session, so I just attach to an existing one. Okay, and we see I have multiple tabs. I've got several things running in several windows. I've got top running to monitor my resource usage. So everything's looking good. All right, so next thing I want to do is I want to connect my IDE. So in my case, I'm using a JetBrains IDE. I'm sure VS Code has something similar. So JetBrains has this thing called a gateway. And you see I already have some development environment set up on my other VM. So I'm gonna create a new, connect to a new host, new connection, root, and what was the IP again? It's the IP of the new guy. I connect, you can specify a private key if you've got one stored. Otherwise, I have the private key, I already have it set up on DigitalOcean, and I have that stored in 1Password. Looks like I already authenticated with 1Password, so it's just using that private key. So we got a connection, and now we want to add a development environment. So you can use any of these. So in my case, the application is a Go application, so I want to use a Goland, and I know my project directory is root fleet. Now let's see, download the IDE and connect. Let's see how long this takes. Our downloading, okay. All right, I'll pause this until it's done. So it's up. So what actually happened here is that this agent connected to the remote environment, installed an IDE there, or what's called an IDE backend, and then opened up a special version of the IDE here on my client machine that's connected to the backend where most of the processing is happening. So ideally, I want to work on both the backend and the front end. But in this case, we found that the amount of memory, it was actually insufficient to do both. So I'm running my application, I'm running this IDE backend, I'm running a couple of Docker containers. So in our case, looking at the top of my original development environment, it's basically using most of the 8 gigs. So we found if we try to create another IDE, the memory is just insufficient, and these backends disconnect. It's still possible with 8 gigs to use one IDE at a time, but if you want to run multiple IDEs, like front-end development and back-end development or something like that, we need more memory. All right. So now let's talk about what we can do with this remote development environment. And I've been using it for a few days, and it's been usable. So let me run through the basics. So first, we definitely want to be able to run unit tests, and I was able to do that. I was able to go to a test and run it from the IDE. I was able to make code changes and then restart. Yeah, make the code changes here. Then I go back to my terminal. I kill the existing server, restart, or if in case it's front end, it's automatically refreshed. So that was all working great. And then I should be able to connect to the database. So here we have a public IP, and I'm running Docker as a wrap around the database. So what Docker does is it opens up a port through IP tables that is visible to the public. Now that is a security issue because I don't want anyone to connect to my development database, especially if it's a development database and oftentimes everyone's using the same username password for their development database. So either you need to secure your development database with a unique password that's just specific for this development instance, or another option is to use a firewall. So Docker itself has documentation for how to restrict external connections to containers. And using IP tables, which may be a little intimidating or complicated for some people. So this is the basic rule for excluding all connections except for the one IP. So you would specify this. Here you would specify the actual interface like ETH0. And then this would be the IP, your IP that you're trying to connect from. And then another thing you'd need to do is you need to persist this rule. One way to persist this using Ubuntu is to use the IP tables persistent package. Now, if you're using DigitalOcean, and probably other vendors have a similar feature, is it's possible to actually set up a firewall using the vendor. So for DigitalOcean, you would go to networking, and you would create a firewall here, and here you would specify, the rule that. And there's an even rule for MySQL, so that specifically this port, or you can use a custom port. And then here you could specify your IP. So that's another way to secure. Okay, so let's kind of summarize what we've learned when using this development environment. So overall, it's usable. Definitely, it's a good option for me if I want a second development environment. What I found is occasionally there's some latency. Even when I'm clicking options, they're not as snappy as they are when running a local version, or I'm using shortcuts. Sometimes they don't work right away. Sometimes there's a delay. And that doesn't happen all the time, but occasionally I noticed it. I noticed that some features are missing. For example, when I bring up the search, I don't have a search by text option, which I often use when I'm searching for like error messages. So the feature set of this IDE when running remotely seems a bit different than the feature set of the standard local IDE. Another thing I found is when I installed Copilot, it wasn't quite working out of the box. I didn't fiddle with it to try to get it working. Like it was connecting to Copilot. I can use Copilot chat, but it wasn't giving me suggestions in my IDE. Perhaps I just didn't throw the right options, or perhaps something else is going on. In any case, it's not a deal breaker for me because JetBrains also has their own Copilot version. So if I really needed that, I could switch to theirs. So in general, it's usable. If I'm able to run my dev environment locally, I would do that. But certainly having a remote dev environment is useful, and I can be productive using a remote dev environment. So that's it for today.